In this video, I want to do a brief summary of the book of Genesis, looking at authorship, date, historical background, purpose, flow of thought, and an outline. And I'm trying to shorten what I have done before in more of a brief overview. So it is a revision because I am shortening it and certainly revising it by doing that. So we began, first of all, with the title. The book of Genesis means beginning. And basically, the Hebrew is Bereshit, but the Septuagint has Genesos. And that's where we get the English for the book of Genesis, for the title. The author is Moses. That is the conservative point of view that I particularly hold to. We have given argumentation as to why conservatives hold to the view of Mosaic authorship, theological conservatives, rather than to the JEDP hypothesis. I've dealt with that in a previous longer video. As to the date, 1447 to 1407 could be the approximate time when Moses, whom I believe was the author, could have written Genesis. The historical background is that it starts off tracking biblical time from Adam to Abraham to the end to Joseph. And it's a beautiful summary of that period, also rehearsing the Abrahamic covenant and how God established that. So the purpose of Genesis is to give a brief survey of divine revelation from the beginning of creation until the Israelites were brought into Egypt. And as I said, the Abrahamic covenant plays a very important part. We see it in Genesis 12, Genesis 13, 15, 17, 22, and so forth, 26. It's repeated over and over. And not only to Abraham, but to his descendants. So let me look at the flow of thought now of Genesis. The theme of the book of Genesis is beginnings. The book of Genesis divides then naturally into two major sections. The first deals with the beginning of human history from creation to the Tower of Babel, 1:1 to 11:9. And the second major section discusses the beginning of Hebrew history, tracing it through the patriarchs Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph, chapter 11:10 through chapter 50. The first major section can be entitled The Beginning of Human History. The author traces four very important events that introduce the origin of all later revelatory history. The first major event is the creation of man and the world in Genesis 1:1 to 2:25, in which the author gives to his readers not only the order of the universe and its origin and foundation, but also the origin and creation of man and woman. This sets the stage by which God can begin to carry out his purpose in his theocratic kingdom. Excuse me. From the introductions, the author quickly moves to the second important history or event, and that is the fall in chapter 3:1 to 5:32. He not only discusses the facts of the fall in chapter 3, but also gives the fruits that follow it, the negative fruits, so to speak. The event is vital to all subsequent history, for it describes where and when sin entered the human race and the results of its entrance. We also see in chapter 3 the judgment of Satan in 3:15, the woman in verse 16 of 3, and man in 3:17 to 19. But the event also issues in the promise of the availability of salvation in the woman's seed, especially Genesis 3:15. Following these, I'm sorry, I'm having some trouble with it. Following these judgments and promises, the consequences of the fall are seen in murder in Cain and Abel, in the ungodly line of Cain in chapter 4, and in death, especially reiterated in chapter 5. After the fall, the next important event in the beginning of human history is the flood, chapter 6:1 to 10:32. Here Moses discusses the cause and preparation of the flood in chapter 6:1 to 18, and rescue from and culmination of the flood in 7:1 to 8:19. And finally, the subsequent history after the flood in 8:20 to 22. The cause seems to be, at least one interpretation, the intermarrying of the godly line with the ungodly line. Only Noah and his seven family members, or 7 of his family members, were preserved in the ark, while the rest of the world perished. Following the flood, the sin of Noah issues in the curse on Canaan, which is looking at the Canaanites and the judgment in the book of Joshua. At this point, the reader is introduced to the sons of Noah, which the variant nationalities of the world have come from. The final and climactic event in this section is very important in that it summarizes the Tower of Babel, where we see here the sin of pride and disobedience recounted, along with the judgment of God, which resulted in confounded speech and scattering. It is at this point that the diversification of languages sees its origin. I'm going to stop here. Hopefully in my next video I won't have to cough as much. I'm going to stop here because this summarizes the first major section, which we might call the beginning of human history, 11:1 to 11:19, where we've seen creation, we've seen the fall, and then we looked at briefly the flood and what happened in relationship to it, and finally the Tower of Babel. And I'm going to stop there. I'm going to do these in parts. I'm not only doing a revision, I'm trying to shorten it so it can be listened to in maybe 15-minute segments. So I'm stopping at this point.